This is Lecture 3 in PSYC4981. Topic for today is biological traditions and Darwin. But before I do that, I just have a few things I want to finish off from the last lecture. For instance, one of the things I want to talk about is I have this other key figure who belongs to last week's lecture on the rise of experimental psychology, and that person is Hermann Ebbinghaus. You can see his credentials here, but a key development in his life when he was traveling independently after receiving his PhD in philosophy. And he came upon a copy of Fechner's Elements of Psychophysics at a bookstore in London. After reading Fechner, Ebbinghaus grew excited about applying objective methods to the study of psychology. He chose memory, though, instead of perception for his topic. At the University of Berlin, he set up the third psychology laboratory in Germany to begin this research on memory. Now, he pioneered the use of nonsense syllables such as pib or what. He believed it wasn't a good idea to study more meaningful material like poetry or prose because it's learned. He said, the content is now narrative in style, now descriptive or now reflective. It contains now a phrase that is pathetic, now one that is humorous. Its metaphors are sometimes beautiful, sometimes harsh. Its rhythm is sometimes smooth and sometimes rough. But by contrast, nonsense syllables were meaningless and they were uninfluenced by previous learning. By using these nonsense syllables, Ebbinghaus hoped to discover fundamental laws of learning, much like Fechner had done with psychophysics. The use of nonsense syllables also provided a quantifiable measure of learning and memory in terms of things like counting the number of syllables that be remembered and the number of trials that were required to learn a list of a given length. Now, in his research, Ebbinghaus was his own research participant. And you might think this would lead to some sort of experiment or bias, but Ebbinghaus was so careful about his methods that his findings have proven remarkably resilient in the many years since. That is, many other investigators have obtained essentially the same results. His experiments involved constructing lists from a pool of 2,300 nonsense syllables, and all 2,300 were used before any were repeated. The experiments took place between 1879 and 1880, and then again in 1883 to 1884. In learning a list, Ebbinghaus would go through the list from beginning to end, reading the syllables at a rate governed by a metronome at 150 beats per minute. In one of his experiments, he read and reread lists of 13 nonsense syllables until he could recite each list perfectly twice from memory. After various intervals, he then determined how long it took him to relearn a list. And naturally, the longer the time since the original learning, the longer it took to relearn a list. From these experiments, he was able to estimate how much had been forgotten after different periods of time. His results have been replicated and can be summarized in the famous forgetting curve, like the one that you see here. He similarly demonstrated that we also learn in a learning curve. Ebbinghaus believed that when he learned a list of items, associations appeared to be formed not only between the adjacent items in the list, but also between all the items in the list. The strongest connections were the ones that were like in the adjacent areas, and those that linked to non-adjacent ideas were called remote associations. This concept of remote associations, the idea that you could have connections to things that are not just nearby on the list, has been very influential over the years. It's consistent with a concept of the mind as a vast network of connections of varying strength. And the ability to use remote associations has been linked to creativity, and the hypothesis being that the ability to recover remote associations will allow the person to experience ideas that do not occur very often to people, but are potentially valuable. Now, besides all this work in memory and this groundbreaking stuff that still has lasted all of these many, many decades, another thing to know about Ebbinghaus is that he was another organizer of experimental psychology. It's important that you can contrast Ebbinghaus with what Wundt was doing down in Leipzig. So some of the guiding principles of Ebbinghaus's psychology, which is more akin to kind of like a normal science of psychology, is that he did argue that psychology should be separate from philosophy. So again, even though he had his PhD in philosophy, he was ready now for psychology to make the formal break from philosophy. The scope of psychology, he thought, compared to Wundt, should be broadened. It should include many more topics, and it just would be a matter of figuring out what the proper scientific method would be to cover all those different topics. He himself focused on a really limited domain, memory, but that fit with an argument that he had, which is that every psychologist should specialize. There should be some focus for their particular research program. And he also reconciled pure and applied psychology in the sense that, you remember, Wundt wasn't really into applied psychology, whereas Ebbinghaus thought that was an important component of psychology, that we should have both the theoretical or the laboratory-based psychology, but it should also be able to be applied to problems outside the laboratory. So that's Ebbinghaus. And sort of just to wrap up the content from Lecture 2, you can see that we were talking really about German psychology there at the end of that lecture and even till today. So German psychology was really where it was at. The scientific psychology kind of took off in Germany there in the late 1800s. I mentioned this before, that one of the distinctions that was really important at that time was this difference between Naturwissenschaft versus Geisteswissenschaft, which was, where was psychology going to be? Was it going to be in the natural sciences, Naturwissenschaft, or was it going to be more in the social sciences, Geisteswissenschaft? There were two major journals by this point in Germany. We have Philosophical Studies that Wundt had started, which was sort of his house journal. And then there was this rival new journal that was started by Ebbinghaus in 1890 called the Journal of Psychology and Physiology of Sense Organs. And it opened up more publications for psychologists who weren't necessarily in Wundt's lab, another place for them to have an outlet. Another distinction was that some people had this sort of schools approach of Wundt, which was, the schools approach was to say that not only was the topic limited by whatever your professor said, but the methods that you used would be also followed by that. So Wundt became sort of a leader of a school of thought or a school of psychology where you used introspection and only looked at the certain questions that Wundt was interested in. And then his students were like his disciples that would then, kind of clone that school and do that somewhere else. Ebbinghaus had this more broad view of psychology, which was that, that there could be a lot of different methods to it and a lot of different topics. And so therefore he didn't want to advocate that there is one particular way you should do psychology, and therefore his students didn't have a particular way of doing psychology as well. So this is just a kind of a tension that sort of happens over the next few decades, whether or not we're going to kind of have these schools of psychology, aka the way Wundt would do it, or do we have some more broadened type of psychology, normal science, the way Ebbinghaus would talk about it? All right, so back to today's topic about the how biology is related to the development of psychology. Now, first, let's do a quick tour over the centuries of what scientists learned about the brain. It's interesting that Aristotle, who we talked about at the last lecture, dismissed the importance of the brain because of some accurate but misleading observations that he made. Although they are richly supplied with blood during the life, the brain's blood vessels rapidly drain after death. So during Aristotle's time, it appeared that a dissected brain was nearly uniform in its blood being gone, and it had a grayish color and a sponge-like consistency. So you imagine every time it picks up a brain, there doesn't seem to be much blood in it, and it just looks kind of gray and spongy. He had also heard of soldiers whose heads had been injured in battle, and when you touched their brains through their openings in their skull, they reported no sensations. So Aristotle found it hard to believe that such a bloodless, insensitive, and just generally unimpressive looking organ could be the seat of the highest human faculties. Instead, he thought that these were housed in the heart, and the brain was really just a condenser for overheated vapors or humors that rose up to the top of the body. Aristotle's viewpoint, unfortunately, dominated others' thinking about the brain for the next 2,000 years. It wasn't until Descartes, who believed that the pineal gland in the brain could be the intersection point between the body and soul, that people started thinking seriously again about higher functions being at the brain. So following from Descartes, the brain started to attract attention. There was this Oxford physician, Thomas Willis, who was also one of John Locke's teachers, who published the first accurate and detailed anatomy of the brain in 1664, illustrated with plates by the celebrated architect Christopher Wren. You can see this is one of the drawings right here in the slide. He thought that the brain consisted of two kinds of substances. One, a pulpy gray matter, occupying the outer surface or the cortex of the brain, the inner part of the spinal cord, and several other centers within the brain. And two, fibrous white matter in other regions. Now, Willis speculated that the white matter consisted of narrow canals whose function was to distribute spirits generated in the gray matter. He also more accurately described the blood vessels of the brain, and it was soon after that doctors discovered that interruptions to the blood supply of the brain could cause strokes. And by the early 1700s, it was recognized that injuries to one side of the brain often produced paralyses or losses of feeling somewhere on the opposite side of the body. But despite such discoveries, the brain really didn't become an object of major scientific interest until the 1800s, mainly because it became implicated then in a sort of pseudoscientific craze that captured the imagination of the public as well as scientists. This German physician, Franz Joseph Gall, played a major role in these developments as he convincingly demonstrated the general importance of the brain for all of the higher human functions, while also originating a popular movement called Phrenology. Gall had carefully examined the similarities and differences among brains of many different animal species and children, elderly and brain-damaged people, as well as normal human adults. In a general but convincing way, these studies showed that higher mental functions correlated with the size and intactness of the brain in question, particularly its outer surface or cortex. Across different species, Gall demonstrated that animals with larger brains manifested more complex, flexible, and intelligent behavior than other animals that had smaller brains. This was overall a good observation that is supported in a general way even today. But the problem was that all of this became embedded in a doctrine that his followers labeled phrenology, which meant science of mind. So phrenology is really, the Greek word phrenos is really the word for mind. And so interestingly, instead of psychology, it's called phrenology. It's the science of the mind. Gall believed that discrete psychological faculties were housed within specific parts of the brain. Moreover, he believed that the bumps and the indentations on the surface of the skull reflected the size of the underlying brain parts and therefore of the different faculties. This theory never was adopted by scientists, however, because the data were just so poor. So Gall went ahead and told the public about it, and soon he had many followers out in the public who weren't scientifically inclined, but they started giving lectures and doing head readings to members of the public. And like I said, it became sort of a craze. This just made phrenology even less acceptable by the scientific community. I'm going to talk more about how this phrenology then found its way to the United States later in this lecture, so I won't say much more about it at this point. Except that some people who followed Gall started to look for more evidence of some of the brain localization. One of them was Pierre Flourens, a French surgeon, who was able, with the technique of ablation in experiments with animals, to demonstrate localization of function. He had great surgical skill, and he could remove precisely defined areas from the small brains of his animal subjects without causing their death. He always carefully nursed his animals back to as healthy a state as possible before drawing any conclusions, to avoid confusing the effects of the surgical shock or post-operative complications with the permanent effect of his ablations. He performed such ablations of the cerebellum and determined that it was important in the coordination of movement. He also looked at the cortex and was able to establish that some of the higher functions were associated with specific brain areas. And then there was Paul Broca, who was a French physician who worked with a patient named Tan. He had shown up at Broca's surgery, terminally ill and with gangrene in his right leg. And what Broca learned was that Tan, 21 years earlier, had lost his speech, while remaining otherwise healthy and intelligent. Tan could understand what was said to him, point correctly to named objects, and answer numerical questions by holding up the appropriate numbers of fingers. But he could only use words when he was angry, and these would only really just be some profane phrases. Otherwise, the only thing he could vocalize was the syllable tan, which he repeatedly said whenever he wanted to speak, and that's how he came up with this name of Tan as his nickname. Now, after Broca had tried to save his life, Tan only lived just a few days more. But after his death, Broca then promptly autopsied Tan's brain, and he found an egg-sized portion of the left frontal hemisphere had clearly been damaged, which its center was very close to what Gall had determined with his phrenology was the organ of verbal memory. So Broca speculated that this area was important to speech production, and he started to look for other cases like Tan, and then would perform autopsies on them when they had passed. Over the next 2 years, he found 12 such people, and their autopsies included the same region of the left frontal lobe. This area is now known as Broca's area, and this disorder that he originally called motor aphasia is now just called aphasia, which means a loss of words. Around this time, two young German physiologists, Fritsch and Hitzig, had the idea that the brain might be sensitive to electrical stimulation. So they started with the electrical stimulation of an exposed cortex of a dog, and they would apply mild electrical stimulation to various points with a pen-like electrode. They soon discovered the motor strip in the dog brain and how stimulation of one part of that strip would cause movement in a corresponding area, like the right paw. And likewise, they also found the sensory areas. Then, in 1874, the German neurologist Karl Wernicke started to work on the problem of aphasia based on the work of Broca. He found 10 patients who had a language disorder which he called sensory aphasia. These patients could speak perfectly fluently with correct syntax, but their understanding of spoken language was severely limited. And their speech was also marked by numerous peculiar words and mispronunciations. Well, upon death, he would autopsy these patients, and he found that they had suffered damage or lesions to a part of their left temporal lobe close to the auditory areas, which was different from Broca's area. This brain region is now known as Wernicke's area, and we now consider this kind of aphasia, this sensory aphasia, as being due to some sort of lesion or damage to that, to Wernicke's area. So those are a lot of interesting findings that all happened within a couple decades of each other. So as you approach this time now with Wundt and James coming onto the scene, as well as other experimental psychologists who are formalizing psychology, there are a lot of great discoveries that they can incorporate into their new psychology, and which, for instance, when you read James, you can sometimes see that he mentions. But before we get to that new psychology, there is one more biological contribution to consider, and that's the theory and research around evolution. Now, most of us associate Darwin with evolution, but evolutionary ideas of a speculative kind had been aired prior to the 19th century. Like Leibniz and Kant had both sketched theories of evolution. Erasmus Darwin who was the grandfather of Charles, had outlined a theory of evolution in 1794. A Scot named Lord Monboddo, not a very fortunate picture here of Lord Monboddo, but he had his own theory of evolution based on his work on language, and he suggested that man was actually related to the orangutan back in 1773. And then when you get to the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, the French botanist Lamarck had propounded a theory that the species of today were descended from those of previous times, but that these changes had been acquired through the transmission of acquired adaptations. He had these two laws of evolution. One was the law of use and disuse, and this was the law that on a characteristic that an animal might have that's used quite a bit and is helpful for that animal to survive will be passed on to its descendants, whereas behaviors or physical features that are not used very much will eventually be removed or not passed on through inheritance. And then he talked about this law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, that even in the lifetime of an animal, if an animal starts to take on a characteristic that is beneficial so that it lives more fully, it'll pass that on. So that the idea here, the classic example of Lamarck, is this idea that giraffes got longer necks because they kept reaching up to get leaves off of trees, and the longer and longer necks got stretched and got passed down to the next generation of giraffe. And so those giraffes had longer necks as well. But even though you have Lamarck and you have these other theories of evolution, they were just never really accepted by biologists or the public. And there's a reason for this. Well, a few reasons. First of all, why we don't really have a theory of evolution until we get to Darwin. First, the available time since the creation of the world seemed too short for evolution to have been possible. So if most of the public and most scientists are going to follow the Bible, and the Bible says that it's only been a few thousand years since Adam and Eve, there's not really time then to have an evolutionary perspective. You can also say that there wasn't much evidence up until the 19th century about whether or not anything could have been evolved from earlier life. And thirdly, just overall, the reason why there was a failure of acceptance of evolution is because anybody who espoused a theory of evolution would have been opposed to the Bible. But it was the geologists who provided the biologists with time to deal with that first issue. Instead of just the few thousands of years calculated by the theologians, or the 75,000 years worked out by the naturalist Buffon in 1778, it was the geologist Charles Lyell and his Principles of Geology, which he published between 1830 and 1833, that he wrote of an indefinite lapse of ages. As some writers have noted, the change of perspective that was brought about by the discovery of how long the Earth really had been around had been one of the most profound changes in thinking in the human history. Among other things, it now made it possible to have a theory of evolution. And it's worth noting that Lyell's work on geology was one of the few books that Darwin took with him on the voyage of the HMS Beagle. And one of the things that Lyell and others had talked about was the present is the key to the past. Well, we won't go over that theory here, except to note that the economist Malthus had demonstrated that the increasing populations tended to outrun resources, and therefore you'd have a resulting competition of the fittest that survived. So in Darwin's theory, these successful variations were transmitted through inheritance, and the process as a whole was called natural selection. For the psychologists, the important corollary was that the mind was too, that it had evolved just like everything else, any of our organic equipment. Our minds were subject to laws of variation and inheritance, and they were involved in the adaptations of the organisms to their environments. And they were subjected to the same processes of trial and error, just as our bodies would have been. So Darwin is an interesting person himself, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about Darwin, but just know for some key features of his life was that he wasn't much of a student. He was actually got into trouble a lot in class because of his poor study habits. But the big thing that made a difference in Darwin's life was that he had this chance to get on the HMS Beagle, which was going around the world, and he was hired basically as the naturalist to help collect data. So he was on this ship between 1831 and 1836, making observations and collecting specimens to bring back to England, and therefore would be analyzed by the scientists there who were behind this mission. So while he was there and he made all these observations, it's helped him to start thinking about the connection between what Lyell was writing about in geology with the changes that he was seeing in biology. And so, for example, one of the things that he did, this is actually one of Darwin's drawings. You can see that he's actually mapping out here the tip of South America, and he's looking at the different geological makeup of that land. So he's understanding from Lyell's geology how there's different land masses there and different kinds of rock, and he's using that knowledge that he has then to start sort of correlating the idea that also this could be happening in terms of animal life, that you could kind of map where the animals were and what characteristics they had, and perhaps this would tell you then about the evolutionary history of the animal. So later in his life, he published some really key publications, and these were On the Origin of Species in 1859. We have The Descent of Man in 1871, and Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals in 1872. Interestingly, I think all three of these books have relevance to psychology, especially the way that psychology is practiced today. He was actually one of the first people to apply a lot of his evolutionary ideas to psychology questions. For instance, he kept his notebooks on man that were commenced in 1838, and on October 3rd he wrote, "Experience shows that the problem of mind cannot be solved by attacking the citadel itself. The mind is a function of the body. We must bring some stable foundation to argue from." And so he had this lifelong interest in observing human behavior. So when he came back and had came back to England after he had been on the Beagle and he had his first child, he started making an acute study of the development of his infant son that was published as a biographical sketch of an infant in Mind, the journal Mind, in 1877. So it was one of the first big things was just the fact that he kept this sketch about everything that was going through the development of his child and talked about it in this article. In The Descent of Man, he compared the mental powers of man and the lower animals, and he discussed topics such as instinct, curiosity, imitation, attention, memory, imagination, reasoning, sociability, and sexuality. And in his conclusion of The Descent of Man, he came to was that the mental faculties of men and the lower animals do not differ in kind, though immensely in degree. So he was trying to make this point that we had a lot of the same mental structures as other animals. So you can see he's making contributions then to comparative psychology, pointing the way that you could take human mental abilities and compare them to other non-human animals. We talk here about the developmental aspects, that he was interested in how, for instance, his own infant had developed cognitively during his early life, and then published an article about that in Mind in 1877. And he talked a lot about the emphasis of adaptation, about how a lot of our particular interests might be important. A lot of our behaviors would be important adaptations that would have been selected for through natural selection. This emphasis on adaptation had a great influence on the American psychologists that we'll be talking about more next week. And this is perhaps because of his emphasis on survival and adaptation and the shaping forces of the environment. And this emphasis on the environment made American psychologists become more concerned with the impact of education, the workplace, the home. All those institutions and circumstances would impact our adaptation. And so you'll see that the work of leaders like William James and John Dewey and Cattell and G. Stanley Hall all talked about Darwin and evolution as part of their big influence in their work. Another impact of Darwin on psychology was his work on facial expressions of emotion. And he had this great book, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, that I mentioned. And in that, he had plates. These are actually pictures that come from his book of actors and children and photographs of people expressing different emotions in that book and speculating about why we made those facial expressions and suggesting that they have something to do with an evolutionary advantage to communicate our internal states to others so that it would respond to us. And so you can see that the work in the 20th century, I think people like Paul Ekman and Carol Izard would have been heavily influenced by the same approach of looking at facial expressions and looking to see if they're universal across different humans. There was also, by the way, an emphasis on individual differences. Prior to the publication of Origin, people usually thought that any differences among individuals was attributed to differences in their will, how much they tried to do something. All of the older psychologies prior to Darwin had always stressed the importance of training the will and getting people disciplined. And expressions such as diseases of the will or defects of the will were common. So if you're trying to explain why somebody became a criminal or why somebody was successful, it had to do with them shaping their wills. Even Darwin, prior to reading some of the later work, had emphasized that the best thing to do was to have a lot of zeal and hard work, and they were the major parts of any individual differences. But you'll see that as we move on to talk about Galton, that there was also this idea that maybe the individual differences were actually inherited, and there was characteristics here that were passed down that would explain why we have individual differences in psychology. So I'm giving Darwin a pretty quick pass here in this lecture, but I'm just want to point out that I know you've come across Darwin in a lot of other courses and in school, and I think that it's just important to keep in mind that psychology owes a lot to Darwin in terms of these particular contributions. Now I want to move on to the period after Darwin and look at some of the early comparative psychologists, and then we'll even move on to eugenics as kind of a result of all of this. So comparative psychology is this branch of psychology, this focus of psychology that actually compares different animal species to one another in terms of their behavior and their mental functions. And one of the big people who did this was George John Romanes, one of the first comparative psychologists. Now, Darwin had made the case that we had this sort of slow process of small changes called gradations. And this put humans in with the rest of the animals, at least as far as the body was concerned. But the question that he really didn't get to talk about as much as he wanted to was mental evolution. I mean, he wrote a lot about this, but he didn't do a lot of research on it as extensively as this younger acquaintance of his, Romanes, who took this province of mental evolution for his own and apparently had Darwin's endorsement. In fact, Darwin bequeathed much of his unpublished writing on animal behavior to Romanes, and the latter incorporated significant amounts of Darwin's material on instinct into his own work, the book called Mental Evolution in Animals that Romanes published in 1884. So somewhere along the way, like I said, he had caught Darwin's attention and then was able to inherit Darwin's writings on animal behavior. Because very few people were initially in a position to work systematically on problems of animal behavior, Romanes was forced to rely really heavily on anecdotal accounts of the behavioral feats of animals, in which there's this line between observation and interpretation often gets blurred. His evidence then, if you read his book in 1884, isn't that compelling, but his theoretical analysis, primitive as it is, actually casts some key analytical problems into comparative psychology that we still tend to discuss in comparative psychology today. Now, as was customary at that time, Romanes divided animal behavior into two components, instinct and habit. And furthermore, he distinguished instinctive behavior from reflexive behavior by asserting that the former involved perception and therefore consciousness, while the latter, that is, reflexive behavior, was unconscious. Habit for Romanes involved intelligence and was defined as learning by individual experience. Instinct was the opposite. This was the exhibition of adaptive behaviors in the absence of opportunities for any kind of practice or imitation. It was important for Romanes, as for Darwin before him, to document the reality of instinctive behavior because, first of all animals appeared to exhibit at least some instinctive behavior and some of the same instincts. And instincts, like organs, seem to be heritable and thus subject to natural selection. So Romanes believed that ontogeny, one's individual development, recapitulates phylogeny. And this is actually known as Ernst Haeckel's recapitulation theory. So ontogeny, which is like the understanding or the way an individual develops from the development of the fetus through birth, recapitulates, that is, it follows a pattern that is pretty close to what happened in terms of the evolutionary history of the species. And so this recapitulation doctrine held that evolution merely involved the acceleration of ontogenic development, with something new or different added on at the very end. It was a deduction then that humans differed from other animals not in the possession of their ideas as such, but in their capacity for genuine abstract thought, and that these higher forms of cognitive function were these ideas that only humans could have because of our evolutionary history. So in our ontogeny, in our individual development, we're going to go through the same stages of development as other animals, but we get to a point where, as we develop as a child or into an older child, we're able to have abstract thinking and ideas that other animals can't have. So that's why you can do things like talk about whether or not a cat, what is the mental age of a cat compared to a human, or a chimpanzee compared to a human. That the idea is that we all follow the same ontogeny because it reflects the fact that we all have the same common evolutionary history, but at some point, our more recent evolutionary history gives us certain features or characteristics that other animals are not going to have. All right, so another one of these comparative psychologists at this time was Morgan, Conway Lloyd Morgan. He was born in New York, but he ended up in England, and he had studied at the Royal School of Mines and later with Thomas Huxley. Originally, he was a professor of zoology and geology, but he became interested in mental evolution, and he was the first chair at the University of Bristol of the Department of Psychology and Education. Now, in contrast to Romanus, he distrusted anecdotes. And so he focused more on experiments and tried to repeat the key experiments of others. He also strove endlessly for linguistic and conceptual precision, a hallmark of scientific scholarship. His crowning modernity was his overriding skepticism. He was skeptical of the intellectual feats of household pets, and he was often dubious about the purity of instinctive behavior. So he summarized his thinking in a rule that's usually referred to as Morgan's canon. And that is, in no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted as the outcome of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. So basically, this is parsimony, but it contains a significant theoretical orientation of comparative psychology that prevails to the present day, namely the Darwinian notion that evolution has entailed an increase not only in the diversity but also in the complexity of our bodily organization, and that this increasing bodily organization also can increase our psychological and behavioral complexity. And so he's trying to be really careful to say we shouldn't jump ahead, because it could just be that something that is looks like it's only that involves some higher cognition is really just a product of some more minor kinds of cognitions. He also really suggested then, or emphasized, that there was a psychological, he contributed to this notion that there could be quantum leaps that could have taken place in the evolution of intelligent behavior, that it wasn't a simple gradation between us and other non-human animals. There could have been some sort of discontinuity within the biological continuity of Darwin's evolution. For instance, he doubted that non-human animals could perceive relationships. And he concluded in his 1899 Introduction to Comparative Psychology these words. He said, "In denying to animals the perception of relations and the faculty of reason, I do so in no dogmatic spirit, and not in support of any preconceived theory or opinion, but because the evidence now before us is not, in my opinion, sufficient to justify the hypothesis that any animals have reached the stage of mental evolution at which they are incipiently rational. And secondly, that I have all along based my discussion on the canon, that if good reason could be shown for the rejection of that canon, the logical foundation of my argument will be destroyed, and the argument itself will fall to the ground." So trying to, again, summarize what he's saying here, he's arguing that there is a quite a big jump between human cognition and other animals and their cognition. And so that big jump means then it's going to be harder to readily accept that other animals have these same higher functions. And that's why if you follow Morgan's canon, you could rule out that these other animals actually have the same higher functions as us. Now, what's interesting is that this sort of distinction that Morgan's making here is still one that I hear even in modern comparative psychology. So, for example, we have at University of Queensland Thomas Siddendorf, who I think is very much would share the viewpoints of Morgan and believes that it's really hard to actually demonstrate that other non-human animals have a lot of these higher functions that humans supposedly have, and that most of the experiments supposedly that have been done or research anecdotes that have been done to support higher functions in other animals is just not there, that you can usually say it's just based on some simple learning or some other process that could explain why the animal is engaged in that particular behavior. On the other hand, you have a person like Frans de Waal, who is a noted primatologist, who believes that there is more of a gradation between human cognition and the other non-human animals. And so he is not so quick to think there's a huge gulf between human cognition and other animals that, in fact, why do we follow Morgan's canon so deliberately when we're looking at non-human animals? It could just be that, in fact, more of those other animals, if they're showing things like empathy, actually do have empathy. And why don't we start with that rather than going to Morgan's canon and ruling out that the empathy could be explained by some other lower function? I'm not really giving this particular debate the full justice that it should get in a lecture like this, but I hope that you'll think more about this, that it's more, I think it's interesting that Morgan's ideas still are prevalent in comparative psychology, but there's always some pushback from other people who would think that Morgan's canon and his approach to comparative psychology is too extreme. Now, the next person I want to turn to after Darwin and these comparative psychologists is this person here, Francis Galton. He was quite an amazing person. Galton was born in 1822, well before Wundt and James and long before Freud, but made many contributions to psychology in his middle and late middle years that were roughly contemporaneous with them. So his early part of his life wasn't really interested in psychology, but in his late part of his life, he actually made a bunch of important contributions to psychology. The precocious youngest of 7 children in an intellectual middle-class family, he began to read at the age of 2.5, and before 5, he could read almost anything in English, knew a good deal of Latin and some French, and could solve some of the most basic arithmetic problems. At 6, when he went to a local school, he was scornful of the other boys there because they had never heard of the Iliad and other Greek classics. And at 7, he was reading Shakespeare for pleasure. Now, his promising start was thwarted by boarding school, where rote learning was stressed and any natural curiosity and independence were suppressed by flogging, sermons, and punitive homework assignments. And he didn't fare very well when he went to Cambridge University either. When he got there, he felt himself under the pressure to excel, and he was obsessed by examinations and by his academic standing relative to the other students. In his 3rd year, he failed to rank at the very top of the list, and seeing no possibility of becoming a Wrangler, which was an honor student in math, he developed palpitations, dizziness, and an inability to concentrate. He wrote, "A mill seemed to be working inside my head. I could not banish obsessing ideas. At times I could hardly read a book and found it painful even to look at the printed page." In the throes of breakdown, he left school and he returned home. Only after deciding that he was not going to compete for an honors degree, but to settle for a pass degree, was he able to return and complete his studies. His obsession, though, with tests and the ranking of intellectual ability remained for the rest of his life. After Cambridge, he completed medical training, which he had begun earlier, but when his father died in 1844, it left him a well-to-do person at the age of 22. So he dropped the idea of practicing medicine, and for several years he lived the life of a gentleman. He went riding, he did shooting, he attended parties, and he traveled. However, the life of pleasure proved to be thin gruel for his restless mind, and in his late 20s, after consulting the Royal Geographic Society, he led a 2-year expedition at his own expense to the interior of southwest Africa. He came back with a wealth of map information on what had been a blank area of the map, and at 31, he was awarded the Society's gold medal and recognized as a leading explorer. In 1853, he married and limited his traveling from then on. But he was bored with just writing about traveling and organizing exhibitions, so he turned to inventions and produced a number of useful devices, among them a printing telegraph like a teletype, an improved oil lamp, a device for picking locks, a rotary steam engine, and a periscope for looking over taller people in crowded places. By his 40s, he needed a new challenge, and he took up meteorology. It had occurred to him that he could collect simultaneous weather data from many places across England by means of the recently developed telegraph, and therefore plot them on a map and see whether significant patterns became apparent. And when he did this and drew lines connecting the points having the same barometric pressure, he discovered that they described roughly circular low pressure and high pressure systems whose movements across the surface of the Earth were a basis for predicting weather. So you see, that's pretty much the basis of what we have in our weather maps today with isobars, and you're looking at how the pressure is across different places to predict weather. And about the same time, he finally came upon the principal interest of his life, the inheritance of intelligence. In 1859, Darwin's origin had vastly impressed Galton. One of Darwin's basic assumptions was that among the members of any species that there are small inheritable variations of difference, and that evolution occurs through the natural selection of the fittest members. And Galton decided to apply these conclusions to humankind. He reasoned that the evolution of the human species must take place by means of the natural selection of those who have better minds and the transmission of their innate mental superiority of their offspring. So let me just recap a little bit of what I just said, some terms of a few of his accomplishments. So over his lifetime, he published over 340 papers and books. He's the person who actually developed regression and correlation methods with his students. He's the person who introduced the methods of questionnaires and surveys in research. He devised a method for fingerprinting that was used in forensics. He developed this use of maps for meteorology. And he even invented the silent dog whistle. So quite a bit there of things that he accomplished. So I said in his later years, he was interested in meteorology, and then his cousin, who happened to be Charles Darwin, published The Origin of Species. And like I said, he became preoccupied with individual differences and the inheritance of abilities. One of the things that he did in order to kind of understand individual differences is that he developed a counter, and he liked to count things. And he had this little hand counter that he developed where he could have 5 dials registering up to 5 different types. And so as he walked around, he wanted to count like 5 different kinds of flowers or 3 different kinds of grass or whatever it was. As he observed them, he could make a little count with his hand and then therefore know what the exact count was of anything that he was observing. And this included people. He could go around and test people or look at large numbers of people and make counts of different things that he wanted to divide them up on, whether or not they used their hands when they talked or walked fast or whatever it happened to be. So like I said, he was an excessive counter. And one of the things that led him to is to try to understand how genius or high superintelligence was passed down. And so he would go through things like this, where he would actually look at the records of all of the different accomplished people in England at the time, and then figure out how many people there were in all of the records of well-known painters or musicians or senior classics of Cambridge, as you can see here, and then look to see whether or not that person had a relative who also was on one of these notable lists. And so you can see here it says occurrence of a near male relationship. And what he's trying to show here is that it looked to him that people who were highly successful, and especially in terms of their intellect, had another relative who was highly successful as well. And so he suspected then that the reason for this was through heredity, that they must have had a common ancestor who was highly intelligent and passed it down, and that's why they have this this relationship. And he says, you can see here, he's even looking at things like a distinguished father has a distinguished son, a distinguished man has a distinguished brother, and so on. So these are all different pieces of evidence that he's putting together in this book that he published in 1869 called Hereditary Genius, in which he wants to show with numbers that it looks like genius is hereditary. You'll note that one of the things he seems to be overlooking is the fact that people who are relatives probably also come from the same social class, have the same opportunities, they might have certain resources available to them that other people who are not so successful wouldn't have. And so those other things could also be contributing to why you get two people on the same list who are related to each other. But like I said, he was more focused on trying to explain this through heredity. Another thing he was able to do is that there was this International Health Exhibition in 1884, and he set up a laboratory there at this exhibition called the Anthropometric Laboratory, in which people could come in like an exhibit and go through and be tested on a whole lot of different kinds of things that he had there and measured. And his assistants would measure those things at the Anthropometric Laboratory and then keep it in records so they could start collecting large numbers of observations about people's characteristics. And there were a lot of strange sorts of things that he measured about them. It's strange in the sense that he considered these to be related to mental abilities. But here's, for example, is one of them. We have a hand dynamometer, which you would have to squeeze, and you would squeeze this, and it supposedly told you how much grit or will that you had. And so when a person came into this booth and they would squeeze that dynamometer, that would actually be recorded, and then they would try to look to see if maybe relatives of that person who also had come to the booth squeezed just as hard, and so on. Again, overlooking sort of the obvious thing that could do with muscle strength, but at the time that was considered to be more of a measure of your will or your persistence to want to explain things. Another thing that he was interested in was the physical characteristics of the person's face. And he was trying to argue that perhaps criminality was also inherited. And so he tried to look for physical characteristics that would be inherited across different family members to help determine whether or not that person was a criminal. And so you can see in some of his research that he started to look at how different criminalities and different diseases could be passed down in a particular family. And so he thought that all of these things were things that showed evidence of evolution of traits, besides just the physical ones, but also psychological ones or behavioral ones that could be passed down from generation to generation. And so you can see he's making these arguments through his observations through public records. He also, by the way, developed the whole field of human genetics. He's really the person who first started to think about the basis for this. In fact, he's the person who coined the phrase nature versus nurture in this book called English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. He developed what he called the twin method in 1875, where he went ahead and found twins that were either identical or fraternal twins, and then tried to see if their characteristics were more likely if they happened to be identical twins, because they would therefore have a common biological background or genetic background. This method, the twin method, is one that's still used to today, but he's the one that first started using this to kind of back up and support his ideas. He's also the person who coined the term eugenics in a book that he published in 1883 called Inquiries in Human Faculty and Its Development. Now, his use of the word eugenics and what he was thinking about here was that he thought, because so much of this was actually inherited, these characteristics, that it was good to know what those biological characteristics were so that you could encourage people to marry the right person or to partner up with somebody who didn't have a particular negative trait in order to encourage more positive traits, more positive characteristics and success in society. So he thought it should be part of a social policy that there'd be encouragement to get people from the right backgrounds to get together, because then they're more likely to pass off their positive characteristics to the next generation. So it was this idea that, on its surface seems a bit of a, harmless sort of notion that you're just encouraging people with certain characteristics to get together, which of course, taken to the extreme in World War II with Hitler, becomes a social policy in which people are killed. But he is the person who first started talking about eugenics back in 1883. As I mentioned, he's also the person who developed regression. He talked a lot about the normal curve. He developed this bean machine, the quincunx, that would allow you to demonstrate how the normal curve worked. And one of his students was actually Carl Pearson of the correlation coefficient. That was another one of his contributions. As I mentioned, he also did a lot of work on fingerprinting and was the person who first developed a system here of how fingerprints should be recorded and how you could use that to help identify people in a crime. And so he had a little fingerprinting kit that he developed there. You can see over there on the right are the fingerprints of Galton himself that were taken when he was 80 years old. For the last section of this lecture, I want to turn to the antecedents of William James. And William James was in the United States. And so you'll notice that up until this point, we haven't really talked about any area outside of continental Europe, a little bit about England, but mainly we've been in Europe and we haven't really moved to North America yet, which obviously is going to be a place where psychology really takes off. And so I wanted to give you some background, some history about the kind of like why psychology took off so well in the United States compared to some other areas. And we can do that by, first of all, just focusing on the fact that America was initially settled by Protestants, not Catholics. In fact, when Catholics first came to America in large numbers, they were forced to remain outside the mainstream of American life. They were often seen as agents of a dangerous foreign power, the Pope. And there were a lot of anti-Catholic riots, and the burning of Catholic churches were not unknown in 19th century America. What emerged most strongly from this dominant Protestantism was Evangelical Christianity. This form of Christianity had little theological content and looked instead to the salvation of the individual soul and an emotional conversion when the person accepted the will of God. It's no accident that many of the early American psychologists, including John Watson, the founder of behaviorism, had originally planned to become preachers. The stock and trade of the evangelical preacher is conversion, playing an audience's emotions to change people from sinners to saints and modifying both their soul and behavior. The goal of many American psychologists in both the functional and behavioral periods was to modify behavior, to make the person of today into the new person of tomorrow. Now, America had its own philosophers in a way that were sort of a reaction to the Enlightenment. For instance, Ben Franklin, with his experiments on electricity that were known in Europe, ended up charming France as the natural man of the New World and who was enshrined as one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson attempted to apply numerical calculations to every subject, from crop rotation to human happiness. His Newtonian mechanism even blinded him to biological facts. He argued against the possibility of Noah's flood by proving that from physical calculations that in any flood, the waters can't rise more than 50 feet above sea level, and that consequently any fossil seashells that were found in the Appalachian Mountains were just unusual rock growths. Romanticism, which was really popular in the 19th century in Europe, touched America only briefly in the Transcendental movement. Henry David Thoreau, for example, decried industry's encroachment on romantic nature. Now, the philosophers of America tended to be more religious, and this reaction against the Age of Reason was a religious one. The more radical ideas of French naturalism were offensive to America's religious temperament, and only certain modern elements of the Enlightenment became important in America. For most people, evangelical Christianity was the most important, which rejected the anti-religious skepticism of the Enlightenment. And one of these philosophers was Thomas Reid, who was called a Scottish common sense philosopher, and he was readily accepted by evangelical Christians. Reid wrote, "I despise philosophy, and I renounce its guidance. Let my soul dwell with common sense." Unlike Descartes and Locke, Reid adopted the older Aristotelian view that perception simply records the world as it is. He maintained that there are three elements to perceptions: the perceiver, the act of perception, and the real object. Our perceptual acts may make direct contact with objects, not only with their representative ideas. He rejected the idea that conscious experience is manufactured out of bits and pieces of sensation. He thought because we directly experience objects as they are, there's no need to posit some force in mind that holds complex impressions and ideas together. The raw material of experience is the object itself. And he believed that we are naturally endowed with certain innate faculties and principles of mind that allow us to know the world accurately and furnish us with essential truths as well. We are constructed by God to know His world. Reid was a clergyman, and his vision of enlightened philosophy stayed within the boundaries of religion. Now, one of his students was Dugald Stewart, and he had wrote in 1792, Philosophy of the Human Mind. And it reads like an introductory psychology text based on everyday experience instead of laboratory experiments. There are sections on attention, association, memory, imagination, and daydreaming. He also devoted 62 pages to showing the practical value of the study of psychology. Through Stewart's work, Scottish philosophy became quite influential, but especially in America. Some of America's earliest college founders were adherents of the Scottish school, and as were some of the important presidents of these colleges and universities in the 19th century. In the hands of later writers, Scottish philosophy became a readily acceptable psychology that was intuitively appealing and consistent with Christianity. Most American colleges, when they were established, were religious, and in the 19th century, Scottish faculty psychology was part of the moral sciences that were taught to students. So that's one important thing, is just to keep in mind this evangelical religion isn't really deep on theology. It has a sort of a primitive psychology that's based on some sort of common sense ideas and things that you get from everyday experience. But another important element to add to all of this is business in America. You see, America came to be a nation of business unlike any other nation on earth. There were no feudal aristocracy, there was no established church, and they only had a distant king when they first started. What remained were individual enterprise and the individual struggle to survive in confrontation with the wilderness and in competition with other businessmen. Out of its interaction with the element of religion, supreme value was then placed on useful knowledge. American Protestants came to think of inventions as glorifying the ingenuity of God in creating the clever human mind. Technology was an American word. Another sense of this business in America was anti-intellectualism. That is, abstract science was scorned as something European and degenerate. What counted was practical accomplishment, and the businessmen valued the same hard-headed common sense that was taught in the colleges. Common sense philosophy told the ordinary person that his or her untutored ideas were basically right, which tended to increase this American anti-intellectualism. Like, why think deep thoughts? If you already have a good sense of what's going on around you, you don't need to think any more deeply than that. Another aspect of all this was that only men were considered as having common sense and practicality. Feeling and sentiment were taken to be the special sphere of women, who in the 19th century were increasingly removed from the world of work. As such, formally domesticated activities like baking, brewing, cheesemaking, spinning, and weaving had become industrialized. This change stripped women of their earlier economic importance and leaving only the realm of the emotions to their rule. Americans also tended to be radical environmentalists, greatly preferring to believe that people's circumstances, not their genes, were the primary cause of human characteristics and achievements. They believed that, contrary to the prejudices of Europeans, that the American environment was the best in the world and would produce geniuses to surpass Newton. There would be no bounds on the perfectibility of humans in the New World, no bounds on the achievement of the free individual. Progress was the order of the day. A cult of self-improvement that dates back to the earliest days of the American Republic began. In the 1830s, there was even a monthly magazine called The Cultivator, which was designed to improve the soil and the mind. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in 1850 of his visit to America that had happened between 1831 and 1832. He said, "The longer a nation is democratic, enlightened, and free, the greater will be the number of these interested promoters of scientific genius, and the more will discoveries immediately applicable to productive industry confer gain, fame, and even power." But he worried that in a community thus organized, the human mind may be led insensibly to the neglect of theory. Aristocracies, on the other hand, facilitate the natural impulse of the highest regions of thought. So this is interesting observations he's having. He's saying that he thinks because Europe, with its aristocracies, kind of allows people to think about their higher regions of thought and philosophy and so on. In a place like America, where your labor matters and your inventions and your quick-wittedness in the environment is more important, that's why you're not getting that sort of higher level of thinking. What's interesting, too, given that this course that we are taking here is at the University of Queensland, is I could ask you this question. What about here in Australia or in Queensland? What are we like in terms of this? In terms of, are we more like the European model, or are we more like what happened in the United States? An answer to that question could look at a little bit about the establishment of the University of Queensland. And I'm going to come back to this later in this course, but one of the things that I've been looking at in my own writing of the history of the University of Queensland Psychology School is looking at some of the reasons why the university was put up. And if you look, for instance, at this book that Clive Moore wrote about the Forgan Smith Building, he talks a little bit about this. He says in the introduction of this book that the idea of a university in Brisbane to serve Queensland was first mooted in 1874, although the real impetus came from a royal commission in 1891. In 1893, a Queensland University Extension Board affiliated with the University of Sydney began to provide lectures, matriculation classes, and examinations for the University Extension Certificate. Then, as part of the celebrations to mark the 50th anniversary of the colony of Queensland, the University of Queensland, begun by Act of Parliament in 1909, officially came into existence in 1910 and received its first students in 1911. Although there were pretensions to match the older universities in the southern capitals, it was also to be a working man's university, training students to increase the level of technical education in a rural state. So it's interesting as he's saying that, the thing about Queensland, it's sort of like pioneering America, that this was supposed to be a working man's university. There might be some pretensions to kind of like do philosophy and stuff like they might do down in Sydney, but the big emphasis was going to be here at the University of Queensland on jobs and productivity and training of people so they could actually labor and do work that was needed for a growing state. It's also interesting as he talks a little bit about the placement of the university here at St. Lucia. He says, the St. Lucia land is situated on a boundary between the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera Aboriginal peoples. The typical pattern of early European settlement in the 19th century was to mark out large pastoral leases in the St. Lucia bend of the river was included in the land of St. John Frederick McDougall, who had pegged out the northern bank of the river from Milton to Moggle. And so he's going on here and talking about the Carmody family who settled here in 1857. You might know we have Carmody Road along right through the middle of St. Lucia here, and how this used to be all farmland, and there was even a sugarcane plantation and a mill at some point. So this was all really land that was being used for agricultural purposes. It says down at the bottom, until the 1870s, Aborigines managed to remain on the western side of the St. Lucia loop of the river, using the scrub and rich waterways down around Anderson's Creek, now in the St. Lucia Golf Club area. They would have been totally dislodged when the area was subdivided in the 1880s into 970 sections of farming and suburban land with 284 individual owners. Now, here's an interesting drawing of what they were planning when they got the St. Lucia land. Keep in mind that the University of Queensland actually started down at Garden Points, down near where QUT is now. That used to be the University of Queensland down there. And then they moved out here after World War II to St. Lucia. And they had all this land out here at St. Lucia with the river going around it. And this was one of the early plans for the way that the university would be laid out here. And you can see the library is right in the middle. Down by the river there, you can see the colleges, which today are still there. You can see where Upland Road comes and so on, and some sport ovals. If you kind of look through the different precincts that they had established for different degrees, you can see biology, physiology, and medicine, chemistry, and so on. But if you look for where would psychology be at that point, you would have to look. It was really found in philosophy at that time period, so it would have been in the arts. And you can see that the arts is a very small part of the entire university from the way it was planned back here in the 1930s. I point this out just to show you that where the arts already fell here at this university, that it was actually just a smaller part of a lot of other degrees that had more practicality. And so in some ways, I think of the history of Queensland, and particularly with the way psychology grew up here, as being something that was always rooted in practical applications, that it was a practical university, like that one phrase, a working man's university. And so therefore, our psychology here was largely practical at the beginning when it became a school of psychology. And just in case you're curious, here's more of what the drawings look like as it evolved. You can see they went from that other plan to this one here that looks more what we see today. So this is actually a drawing before any of the buildings were built. You can see Forgan Smith right there in the middle. And then here's a picture of what it looked like in 1944. And you can see it says here the almost completed main building. Now it's called Forgan Smith, the library and the chemistry buildings and the foundations of the geology at the Richards building in 1944. The buildings in the upper right corner are the barracks for the Australian Women's Army Service and a section of the St. Lucia Farm Training School that was here well up until World War II, where young boys could come and learn about agriculture down basically where the lakes are now. So I only wanted to show you this because of a way for you to kind of think about your own place where you are and how it might fit into that whole realm of intellectualism, anti-intellectualism. Here, by the way, is another picture of St. Lucia in 1966. It's starting to look more like the campus that we have now. Down in the lower left corner, you can see the social science building, and then there's a big parking area behind it, and that is where the psychology building is today. And here's a kind of a closer view of that. And finally, here's a picture of what it looked like in 1974. You can see more buildings are now behind the social sciences building, including where we have our recreation center and so on. But again, that parking lot that you see there is in the middle of those buildings on the left side of the picture. That's where psychology ends up going into a park, a car park, right there. All right, so just a little dabble into Queensland and thinking about where does it fit on all this, like in terms of an analysis. Would you want to think of it as being more practically oriented or more that European thing? And I would argue that perhaps because we were so remote from the rest of Europe and Australia had this sort of pioneering attitude as people were developing new industries here, you could understand why maybe the kind of psychology and the kind of intellectual environment here would have been more like what you find with evangelical America than you would have found, for example, in Germany. Going back, though, to this history that led to William James and the other American psychologists popping up, I wanted to mention here a little bit about Transcendentalism in the mid-19th century. This was a New England kind of way of thinking that was a bit different from the rest of that evangelical Christianity I was talking about. And this was kind of comes closest to Romanticism. The Transcendentalists really desired a passionate encounter with God, and so they embraced Romanticism. They prized individual feeling and communions with nature, similar to Thoreau, who wrote about his solitary sojourn into the wilderness called Walden. We have a sort of a post-Kantian idealism. They believed that Kant's transcendent noumenia were knowable. They believed that there was an order of truths that transcended the senses. But this transcendentalism, this sort of romanticism, was also very American. It supported, for example, an emotional Christianity that put the individual's feelings of conscience above any hierarchical authority. Ralph Waldo Emerson preached self-reliance, always an American ideal. this American intellectual establishment of colleges viewed Transcendentalism and Kant and idealism all with horror. And so a lot of the 19th century colleges wouldn't have talked about Transcendentalism because it was so different from what the rest of the United States was really like at that time. So these people never really had a huge influence over the thinking of America the way I think those evangelical, like Scottish philosophers might have had. To kind of finish this lecture and give us sort of context then for what the next lecture will be when we talk about James and the Metaphysical Club, I want to go ahead and give you an example of how phrenology took off in America. Now, I had already mentioned that early in the 1800s, Gall had come up with this phrenology of the head. And we also have this colleague of his named Johann Spurzheim, who had gone to America in the early 1800s to give a lecture series about phrenology, about this work of Gall. But when he got to the United States, he died a few weeks later from exhaustion. And then he was followed by a British phrenologist named George Combe, who was really well received by educators, but he was considered too theoretical for most of the American audiences. So after those two had come and tried to lecture and get phrenology in America, it was up to these next two guys, Orson and Lorenzo Fowler, who really promoted it. They were both industrious and business-like brothers. They really minimized the scientific content of phrenology and they maximized the practical applications. What they did is they set up an office in New York where clients could have their characters read for a fee. And they wrote endlessly of the benefits of phrenology and published a phrenological journal that endured from the 1840s all the way up to 1911. They traveled around the country, especially the frontier areas, giving lectures and challenging skeptics. They accepted any kind of test of their abilities, including blindfolded examinations of volunteers' skulls. Their phrenology pretended to tell employers what people to hire and to advise men which wives to take. Whereas Gall had believed that the brain's faculties were set by heredity, the Fowlers, however, maintained that weak faculties could be improved by practice, and overly strong ones could be controlled by efforts of will. Many people sought out advice from the Fowlers on how to lead their lives, and they became the first guidance counselors. They also held out hope that the nation and the world can be improved if only every person could be phrenologized. Finally, the Fowlers believed that they served religion and morality. They encouraged their clients to improve their moral faculties, and they believed that the existence of the faculty of veneration, which is a special bump in your head, demonstrated the existence of God, because the existence of the faculty implied the existence of its object. So you see, why I bring this up is I'm saying you got something that's now been sort of stripped of its theory. It's only being sold for its practicality. It works well with this idea that you need to be reliant, that you could improve yourself, because self-improvement was a big thing of 19th century America. And then finally, we have this whole connection to religion, because there is a faculty, for instance, of veneration, which is basically like a devotion to God, that makes phrenology fit in well with religious teachings. So that's the context in which I want you to kind of imagine when these Americans that we're going to be talking about next week, like William James, start talking about psychology, where they're coming from. They're going to take some of these elements, maybe reject other ones, but the psychology that grows up in America is going to be different in tone from what you see back in Europe. So that's all I have for this lecture. See you next time.